Hello everyone. Last time we talked about what a virtue is for Aristotle, in particular what a moral virtue is, how we get moral virtues, what it takes to possess a moral virtue, and what the relationship is between moral virtue and human happiness. In this short video, I'd like to say a little bit more, like to explore in a little bit more depth Aristotle's account of some of the particular moral virtues that we should be aiming to get or put into ourselves if we really want to be happy. The other thing I'll explain in this video is I'll go over the instructions for your short reflection paper. So I'd like to start by reading something from Aristotle. So if you have your books, turn to section 7 of book 2. This is section starts on page 29. I want to read through some of it. There's also a few handouts that I want to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about the assignment. Let's take a look about what he says in this part of the text. So he says in section 7 of book 2, we should state this not only in universal terms, however, but we should also state how it fits the particular virtues and vices. For an account's concerned with actions, whereas the universal ones are common to more cases, the ones that apply to a part are truer, since actions are concerned with particulars, and our account should be in harmony with them. We should ascertain these, then, from the chart. What chart? Well, our editor does provide something like a chart at the end of the book that lists all the particular virtues that Aristotle cites, but I've made my own chart, and I've made that available on Canvas. It's under the Handouts tab. It should look something like this. It lists the virtues and vices about specific things. And so I want to read through the section where he's going through that chart, and I want to talk a little bit about it. So he says, where feelings of fear and confidence are concerned, then courage is the medial condition, whereas of those people who are excessive, the one who is excessive in his fearlessness is nameless. Many indeed are nameless. The one who is excessive in his confidence is rash, and the one who is excessively fearful and deficient in confidence is cowardly. And so if you look at the chart, right, each section, each row on the chart has a different item of concern, something that it is good to some extent to have. And what we're looking for is at least the name of the virtue that's somewhere in the middle. Remember his principle mean, the state and the actions that you should be performing or aiming for should be somewhere in the middle between two extremes. The extremes are the vices, they are the bad habits that one can develop. So with respect to fear, right, you can have just the right amount of fear, you can have too much, or you can have not enough. The name for the virtuous mean when you have enough courage and when you have enough fear is called courage. The vice of excess, when you have too much fear, is called cowardice. And when you have not enough, it's called rashness. And this is the general model that he's going to give for all these particular virtues. Here he's just giving them a name and spelling out where they fit on the chart and what would be their respective vices. He's going to have more details about what it actually looks like in practice a little bit later on. So where pleasures and pains are concerned, not all of them, and even less so where pains are concerned, the medial condition is temperance, and the excess is intemperance. But people deficient in pleasure are scarcely found, which is why people of that sort have not acquired a name. Let us call them insensible. The next item of concern on the chart has to do with bodily pleasures. And there's a virtuous mean, but there's also a way of erring on the side of too much and not enough, appreciating them not enough and sort of being stuck on them too much. So with respect to bodily pleasures, there's a vice of excess called intemperance. There's a vice of deficiency called insensibility, when you're not even appreciating the proper bodily pleasures. And temperance is somewhere in the middle, where you appreciate the important ones, the healthy ones, and you avoid the unhealthy ones. Next to the next one. Where giving and getting wealth are concerned, the medial condition is generosity, whereas the excess and deficiency are wastefulness and acquisitiveness. In the case of these states, people are excessive and deficient in contrary ways, since the wasteful person is excessive in giving wealth and deficient in getting it, whereas the acquisitive person is excessive in getting it but deficient in giving. For the moment, we are speaking in outline in a headline form, satisfying ourselves with just this much. A more exact definition of these virtues will come later. So once again, what he's doing is he's just giving a general model. He's giving the name for the mean and the two vices with respect to each bodily good. We've seen that with respect to fear, courage is the mean, cowardice is the vice of excess, rashness is the vice of deficiency. With bodily pleasures, temperance is indeed a mean, the vice of excess is intemperance, and the vice of deficiency is insensibility. With respect to money, the virtuous mean is generosity, whereas the vice of excess, with respect to spending money, is wastefulness, and the vice of deficiency is acquisitiveness. With respect to money, there are two ways you can err. You can be sort of miserly, right? You can acquire too much without giving it enough, or you can be wasteful, right? You can just sort of throw your money away in any direction. So what he's doing with this chart, and I won't read through all of the different virtues, but essentially what he's doing in this part of book 2 is he's just going through this chart. He's giving a name for each of the virtuous means with respect to each item of concern, as you'll see on your handout. And that's the general model. He says he'll give a more careful definition of each of these later on. And in just a second, I'm going to show you what he says, or where at least he says more about each one of these virtues. But now already I want to jump right to the next writing assignment that I'm having you do for me, which is the short reflection paper. It's kind of putting together a lot of the aspects of virtue that we've been talking about with respect to book 2. It brings in the exemplar principle and the principle of the mean. And it brings in the particular virtues and vices that I've just introduced through the chart. So here's what's going on with the short reflection paper here. Take a look at your assignment sheet, which is available on Canvas and which is also under the assignment on Canvas. In section 7 of book 2, the second half of book 3, and the entirety of book 4 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discusses a wide array of virtues and vices pertaining to various natural goods. The point of this discussion is twofold. First, it aims to give a helpful illustration of virtuous character and virtuous character types, emphasizing that an ethical and ultimately fulfilling human life necessarily involves stable characteristics, habits, behaviors, and attitudes, rather than a disconnected series of individual actions. The second aim of his discussion of the individual virtues is to show how virtuous character types can be plausibly understood as means between the vices of deficiency and excess. One might wonder where the argument for the so-called doctrine of the mean is. Instead of an argument, Aristotle provides descriptions of some types of people that we might already know, in order to show that his approach is pretty much how we already think about these issues, were we ever to sit back and think about them. So that's the background. Here's what you're doing for the assignment. In 2 double-spaced pages, provide a reflection on Aristotle's account of the virtues. Think about those people in your own life whom you consider to be virtuous, that is, those who exhibit virtuous character. How does Aristotle's account match up with your own experience of these virtuous people? Does thinking about their character traits as virtuous means help explain why you think they are virtuous? Are there some traits that they have that are not captured under his analysis or even violate it? For example, even though humility is, strictly speaking, a vice according to Aristotle, is it clearly a virtue in the people you admire and respect? Aristotle's account is supposed to be mostly intuitive, but it is also controversial in some respects. There are a couple of ways you might pin down your thoughts for this assignment. Pick a specific person you take to be virtuous and identify the virtuous characteristics he or she has. Just one? More than one? Do you know anyone who seems to exhibit all the virtues Aristotle discusses? Can you think of any instances in which the virtuous person's virtuous character was revealed to you or others who know him or her? You might also give a sort of informal interview of a virtuous person in your family. What does he or she think virtue is? Would he or she consider himself or herself to be virtuous? Or ask them about other people. For instance, you might ask your grandfather or your grandmother for some stories about times other members of the family have demonstrated virtuous character. Lastly, bring this information together with the material in the Nicomachean Ethics in the ways I suggested above. Does reflecting on these issues as they pertain to real people help or hurt Aristotle's case? As you can see, there are many ways this assignment could be done. Mostly I'm just looking for a thoughtful reflection on the material and the possibility of its application. That's what the assignment sheet says. But let me unpack that a little bit. So what you're doing with this assignment, I didn't go into much detail about the particular virtues and vices because this assignment is more or less getting you to do that on your own and seeing how well you can do. So what you're doing for this assignment Remember the exemplar principle. One of the guidelines that Aristotle gives for how we can figure out what sort of actions and what sort of states we should be aiming for in our lives is we can look to these great examples of virtue, people who are uncontroversially really good people. And he thinks that we can model our lives and our actions according to the lives and actions of those individuals. So what I want to do is, part of what I want you to do is I want you to test the exemplar principle. I want you to try it out. Try identifying one person. Let's stick with one person for this assignment. The assignment will work best if you just stick with one. Pick one person in your life that you know pretty well, that you would say is clearly a virtuous exemplar, is a great example of what it is to be a good person. And then analyze what are like the key characteristics or virtues in this person. What is it about that person that makes you think that they are so morally good? For this assignment, I think it'll work best if you identify probably around 3. So you want to identify like 3 key characteristics of this person that makes you think that they are indeed a great example of virtue. So you're picking someone who's a virtuous exemplar. You're identifying 3 virtues or good characteristics in that person. The next step is to compare this to what Aristotle says, right, about the virtuous person. So you're picking your virtuous exemplar, and then you are identifying 3 key characteristics in that person, and then I guess you just also at that point you should bring in some specific examples of the person demonstrating or exemplifying that particular virtue. So for example, you might want to say, my grandpa is the most virtuous person I know. What are some of his main virtues? Maybe you want to talk about your grandfather's courage. Maybe he lives through some really difficult times. And so what you want to say is that your grandfather is not only courageous, but you want to talk about the particular ways in which your grandfather is courageous, or the particular occasions in which it became clear to you just how courageous your grandfather was. And you do that for 3 different characteristics. Then you go and you check to see what Aristotle says about these particular virtues. Or you try to find as best you can the 3 characteristics that you mentioned, how closely you can get them to line up or not to some of the virtues that Aristotle includes. So once again, you want to check out the chart and see those characteristics there, but you also want to think about what are the key characteristics in your virtuous person that make you think that that person is indeed virtuous. And so what it requires is a little bit more reading. So far what we've got from the part that I read you today, I showed you where he fills out the chart in Book 2. He spells out what the names of the virtues are and what the names are of their respective vices. But it doesn't go into very much detail about what these would actually look like in practice. Where he does this is later on. In the second, he does this a little more in the remainder of Book 2. He does this in the second half of Book 3 and all of Book 4. So if you want to talk about courage, or if you want to talk about generosity in another person, for example, you're going to want to look to see what Aristotle says about those particular virtues. So let me help you out. Let me give you a general idea of where you can find, which will require a little bit extra reading, where you can find where he talks about some of these particular virtues. So if we start essentially with Book 3. If you want to talk about courage in one of your virtuous exemplars, you should check out Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. That's where Aristotle talks about courage, what it looks like, what sorts of things a courageous person does. If you want to talk about someone's temperance, a kind of restraint with respect to bodily pleasures, then you should look to Book 3, chapter 10, 11, and 12. If you want to talk about someone's generosity, which is a common virtue, often when we think of really, truly good people, we think of extremely generous people. So if you want to compare that in someone you know to what Aristotle says about generosity, you should look at Book 4, chapter 1, just chapter 1. And then there's this other virtue with respect to large sums of money. So if you know someone who's like a philanthropist, there's a virtue associated with large sums of money called magnificence. This is what he talks about in Book 4, chapter 2. There is a virtue with respect to receiving honors or receiving compliments gracefully. That is magnanimity or greatness of soul, right? This one he talks about in Book 4, Chapter 3 and 4. There is a virtue with respect to anger, which he calls mild-manneredness, which is sort of an odd translation. But if you want to talk about someone with respect to their, their calm demeanor, then you want to look at Book 4, Chapter 5. If you want to talk about someone's friendliness, you should look to Book 4, Chapter 6. If you want to talk about their truthfulness or honesty, look at Book 4, Chapter 7. If you want to talk about their good sense of humor, which Aristotle too includes as on the list of moral virtues, you should look at Book 4, Chapter 8. And then he has this odd virtue with respect to a proper sense of shame, a proper sense of self-respect, I guess you could say, or a proper sense of upholding something like a good reputation in society. This is in Book 4, Chapter 9. And that takes us through just about all of the virtues on the chart here. So if you look at the chart, I've shown you where in the text you can find his discussions of each of those. To summarize then, the way in which we're exploring the particular virtues is through this assignment. I've only given you the basics with the list, with the chart. Here's what you're doing for the assignment once again. You're going to find someone in your life that you think is a really great exemplar of your virtue, uncontroversially, a really good person. Then you want to identify maybe 3, maybe you can cram in 4 good qualities or virtues that this person has. The key ones, the ones that you think are the most impressive. Then you want to identify some particular times, particular examples in which they have demonstrated or exemplified these particular virtues. And then you want to look to see what Aristotle says about those particular virtues. So, for example, you want to talk about your grandfather's courage or your mother's generosity. Go back and see what Aristotle says about courage and generosity and compare that with how you would describe your grandfather or your mother or whoever you're talking about. Because what we're looking for here is we're testing Aristotle's account, seeing whether it lines up with what we think is the case, whether the way that he describes a virtuous person is how we would describe the virtuous persons in our lives, and whether the way that he describes the virtues is the same way that we would describe the virtues in other people. Along the way, you're also looking to see whether he forgets or omits or doesn't include some virtue that you think actually is really important. Or you might talk about how he mentions some particular virtue you think, I don't really think that's important for the moral life. These are the sorts of reflections I'm looking for. It's only 2 pages. You're free to go over 2 pages. It's only an approximation. I would think you'd need at least 2 pages in order to do this well. But in order to do this well, right, a good reflection paper has some good examples from the person that you're talking about, but also uses some careful details from the particular parts of the text. So don't just tell me that, well, look, my grandpa is courageous and Aristotle lists courage on his chart. That's not enough. Give me some particular thing that Aristotle says about courage and let me know whether that matches up with how you would describe the person that you want to describe. That's what I'm looking for with this assignment. When is it due? It's due roughly a week from today, but there's some flexibility built into that. I would get started on it because we're going to have another assignment next week, so I would get started on that. And let me know whether you have any trouble. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions over email, or we can video chat to talk you through something as you're working on it. Or if you've got something like a structure or outline, you're like, I'd like to talk about this, this, and this, you're free to run that by me as well, and I'll let you know whether that'd be enough or whether you're missing something. So email me if you have any questions. This is your first assignment. It's posted on Canvas. Good luck. Thanks very much.